She was sitting at the dining table, alone, staring silently at her cell phone. 3 unanswered messages, 5 missed calls, notifications from people who needed her urgently, as always. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel guilty. She felt something worse, relief. And it was that relief that terrified her, because relief shouldn't be there, not for someone like her. Someone who has always been the right person, the one who is available, the one who understands, the one who never judges. Someone whose entire identity was built on the ability to feel the pain of others as if it were her own. But at that moment, something inside her had broken, and what came next was not the peace promised in self-help books. It was a strange emptiness, an inner silence so deep that it seemed to scream. Perhaps you know this silence. Perhaps you have already felt this fine, almost imperceptible fracture that happens when you realize that you have spent years living a life that is not yours, that your choices were never really yours, that every yes you gave to the world was a no you said to yourself, and that deep down you didn't do it out of kindness. You did it out of fear. Fear of what? Of being abandoned, of discovering that if you stop being useful, you will no longer be loved, that your existence only has value when it is in service to someone else's existence. This is the silent contract that no one signs, but every pushover carries. I nullify myself, and you don't reject me. It's an old bargain, learned early, probably in childhood, when you discovered that the love of others depended on how much you could disappear. Nietzsche called this slave morality, a way of existing where your value does not come from who you are, but from how much you suffer, from how much you can endure, from how much you sacrifice. And modern society loved this formula. It turned empathy into the highest virtue, compassion into a moral commandment, and self-sacrifice into a synonym for nobility. But they never told you the dirty part of this story, that all this kindness can be the cruelest of prisons. Because when you live like this, you are not loving, you are negotiating. You are trading pieces of yourself for crumbs of acceptance. And worse, you call it generosity. You tell yourself it's empathy, that it's sensitivity, that it's being a good person. But deep down, where the truth lies and you avoid looking, there is something much darker. There is the terror of existing on your own. There is the secret certainty that if you stop saving others, you will have to look at the hole inside you, and that hole seems too big, too dark, too scary. So you keep going, you keep giving. You keep emptying yourself until your body can no longer bear to lie, until the symptoms appear, the exhaustion that won't go away, the nameless sadness, the dreams where you are drowning, being devoured, carrying bodies that are not yours. The unconscious screams what you refuse to hear. This is not love, this is escape. And it is precisely at this moment, when everything falls apart, that the most dangerous question arises. What if I stopped? But stopping is not simple. Because stopping means betraying everything you believed yourself to be. It means looking in the mirror and recognizing that the kind, selfless, and available person you built may have been a mask all along. Jung called this a persona, the face you show to the world, the fabricated identity that protects you from revealing who you really are. And the problem isn't having a persona. The problem is when you forget that it's a mask, when you spend so much time pretending to be the good, understanding person who never gives up on anyone, that you lose touch with what lies beneath. And what lies beneath? Anger, resentment, exhaustion, the urge to scream, "What about me? When is it my turn?" But these things cannot be said. They cannot even be felt. Because if you feel anger, you are selfish. If you complain, you are ungrateful. If you close the door on someone who is suffering, you are cruel. So you push all of that into the basement of your psyche. You lock it in the dark. And you believe that if you don't look at it, it will disappear. But it doesn't disappear. The shadow, that region of the soul where everything you reject lives, doesn't disappear because you ignore it. It grows. It feeds on what you deny. And one day it explodes. It could be an illness. It could be a panic attack. It could be depression that seems to come out of nowhere. Or it could be something more subtle. That moment when you're doing exactly what you've always done. Listening to someone vent, solving someone else's problem, being the safe haven you always are, and you feel nothing. Empty. As if you were watching your own life from afar, playing a role you no longer remember why you accepted. This is the collapse of the persona. And it's painful because you realize something devastating. You are not who you thought you were. Worse, you never were. That entire identity, the person everyone knows, everyone loves, everyone seeks, is a construct. A character created to survive in a world that would not accept the truth of who you are. And now, with the mask cracking, you are faced with an impossible choice. Either you glue the pieces back together and continue pretending, or you let it fall and face the terror of not knowing who is underneath. Think of a child who learned too early that crying was annoying, that expressing anger was dangerous, that asking for attention was selfish. That child quickly discovers a survival strategy. If I am useful, if I don't cause trouble, if I take care of others instead of needing care, then I will be safe, I will be loved, or at least I won't be abandoned. And that strategy works. For a while, the child becomes the helper, the responsible one, the mature one, the empathetic one. Adults praise them, peers seek them out, and within that child a belief crystallizes. My value lies in what I do for others, not in who I am. This belief does not disappear in adulthood. It becomes more sophisticated. It becomes identity. It becomes purpose. It becomes their reason for existing. And then you have an adult who can't say no, who feels guilty when they prioritize themselves, who interprets any act of self-care as selfishness, who measures their own worth by the number of people they can save, help, carry. And the more people depend on them, the more important they feel, more necessary, more real. But there's a problem with this equation. When your existence depends on being needed, you need the people around you to continue needing you. You need them not to grow up too much, not to heal completely, not to become independent. Because if they're fine without you, who are you? If no one else comes to you in crisis, what is your role? If you're not saving anyone, do you still have value? This is where things get dark. Because you realize you weren't helping out of pure love. You were helping out of necessity, the need to feel important, to avoid emptiness, to not have to look at yourself. Sartre called this bad faith, when you lie to yourself about your own intentions, when you convince yourself that you have no choice, that this is just how you are, that you were born empathetic and cannot change. But that's a lie. You always had a choice. Only choosing meant facing the fear of being disposable. And that fear was too great. So you continued, year after year, relationship after relationship, friendship after friendship, always the same pattern. You give everything. They receive everything, and in the end you are exhausted, invisible, alone. And when you finally dare to complain, when you finally say, I'm tired too, I need help too, the silence is deafening. Because the people you attracted didn't come to exchange. They came to consume, and you taught them to do that. You created the role, distributed the script, and now you're stuck in the play. Until one day something inside you breaks. It can be gradual or sudden. It can be a betrayal, a disappointment. A moment of brutal clarity where you realize, I've spent my whole life saving people who would never save me back. And that realization doesn't come with relief. It comes with fury, an ancient deep-seated anger. Anger at yourself for allowing it. Anger at them for taking advantage. Anger at the world for calling it love. But along with the anger comes something even more disturbing. Shame. Shame for having been so naive. For believing that if you gave enough of yourself, eventually it would be reciprocated. Of having confused emotional dependence with intimacy, of having wasted so much time, so much energy, so much of yourself on people who never really saw you. And that shame burns. It burns because it is directed at yourself, because it is easier to blame others, but deep down you know, you allowed it, you accepted the crumbs, you stayed. And it is from this toxic mixture, anger, shame, exhaustion, that the first refusal is born, not as a heroic act, but as a survival instinct. Like the last breath of a part of you that still wants to live. The first time you say no is like walking through an invisible door into unknown territory. It seems small. Maybe it's just a message you don't reply to, a request you ignore, an invitation you decline without explanation. But inside it's an earthquake. Because you're not just saying no to someone. You're saying no to the version of yourself that promised never to do that. And the guilt comes immediately. Not as a light thought, but as a physical sensation. A weight on your chest. A tightness in your throat, an inner voice that isn't yours but that you recognize. It's the voice of all the people who once told you that being good means nullifying yourself, that loving means sacrificing yourself, that caring for others is more important than caring for yourself. And that voice now screams, selfish, insensitive, cruel. It accuses you, it judges you, and you, still fragile in your attempt to defend yourself, almost believe it. Kierkegaard wrote about the existential leap. That moment when you need to act without guarantees, without proof that it will work, driven only by the need to be faithful to something deeper than security. Choosing yourself is exactly that. It's a leap into the dark, because you don't know who you are without the role of savior. You don't know if you can live without the validation that comes from being indispensable. You don't know if the love you received was for you or for what you did. And finding that answer is terrifying. But what's even scarier? The reaction of others. Because when you finally close the door, even if gently, even if with affection, something changes. The people who always sought you out begin to drift away, not because you were cruel, but because you are no longer functional. You are no longer available to carry what they don't want to carry. And then it becomes clear. Many of the relationships you called love were in fact transactions. They needed a container for their pain, and you agreed to be that container because you thought it would make you loved. Schopenhauer spoke of compassion as something that should arise from a deep perception of the unity between beings, not as a moral obligation, but as a spontaneous recognition of shared suffering. But what you experienced was not that. It was something else. It was compassion as a bargaining chip, as a survival strategy, as anesthesia for your own emptiness. You felt the pain of others so intensely because it was easier than feeling your own. And now, without that distraction, you are left alone with what you have always avoided, yourself. And then the real descent begins, because choosing yourself is not a single heroic act. It is a sequence of daily choices, each one painful, each one questioned. It's waking up and deciding not to check if someone needs you before asking yourself what you need. It's feeling the pang of guilt when you prioritize your rest. It's hearing the inner voice telling you that you're being selfish and still not turning back. There are days when you almost give up, days when loneliness weighs so heavily that you think, maybe it would be better to go back. At least I knew who I was. At least I felt needed. And that temptation is real, because the ego prefers a known prison to uncertain freedom. It prefers to suffer within a familiar role than to risk discovering that without that role, you might be nothing. But it is precisely at this point of greatest fragility that something begins to emerge. Something that was buried so deep that you had forgotten it existed. It is anger, but not explosive, chaotic anger. It is lucid anger, sacred anger. The anger of someone who finally realizes they have been deceived, not only by others, by themselves. You were wrong to believe that disappearing was love, that annulling yourself was generosity, that dying a little every day to keep others alive was nobility. Nietzsche said that we need to go beyond good and evil, beyond the moral categories that have been imposed on us. And that's what happens when you embrace this anger. You realize that it doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you a living person. Because anger in this context is not destruction. It is protection. It is the soul survival instinct saying enough. This is no longer acceptable. It is the boundary you never had the courage to draw. And now it is being drawn with fire. Along with anger come other things you have repressed, desires, wishes, dreams you shelved because they weren't about saving anyone. They were about living. That trip you never took because someone always needed you. That project you abandoned because you had no energy left after taking care of everyone else. That relationship you didn't allow to happen because the person didn't need to be saved, and that left you with no role. And as these things resurface, you realize something terrible and liberating at the same time. You have needs, you have limits. You are not an inexhaustible source of understanding and patience. You are human, fragile, limited, and pretending you weren't cost you years of your life. Years you gave to people who never asked if you were okay, who never noticed when you were gone, who only came back when they needed something. This realization does not come easily. It comes with grief, because you have to bury the fantasy that if you were good enough, they would finally reciprocate, that if you gave them one more chance, they would change, that your sacrifice would eventually be seen, recognized, valued, but it won't, because the game was never about you. It was always about what you could offer, and when you stop offering, the game is over. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes after this realization. It's not the loneliness of being physically alone. It's the loneliness of realizing that you've been emotionally alone the whole time, even when surrounded by people, that no one really knew you, because you never showed yourself. You only showed the functional version, the useful version, the version that solved problems. And now that this version is falling apart, you realize there is no one on the other side waiting to get to know who you really are, because they were never interested in that. And it is there, in that deafening emptiness after the end of the game, that you begin to hear something new. It is not a loud voice. It is not a mystical revelation. It is something quiet, almost a whisper, coming from a part of you that has been silent for so long that you didn't even remember it existed. And it asks softly but insistently, what if you mattered as much as they did? What if your life was as valuable as theirs? What if you didn't have to destroy yourself to deserve to exist? And there is no ready answer to that question, but it opens a crack, a tiny space between what you were and what you can become. And it is in this crack that something begins to grow. It is still fragile, vulnerable, but it is there. It is the first seed of something you never had. Self-respect. Not the performative kind of self-esteem you pretended for others, but something genuine, silent, true. An inner voice that whispers for the first time in your life, I deserve to exist. not because of what I do, but for the simple fact that I exist. That voice, fragile, almost inaudible at first, does not come with fanfare. It does not save you instantly. It does not dissolve guilt overnight, but it plants a seed of doubt in the certainty that once seemed absolute. The certainty that you only deserve love if you are useful. And that doubt, however small, is revolutionary, because it is the first time you question not the behavior of others, but the belief that has sustained your entire life. And to question that is to enter dangerous territory. It's like pulling a thread from a fabric and realizing that if you keep pulling, everything will unravel. The entire structure you built, your friendships, relationships, sense of purpose, was tied to that thread, to the idea that you needed to nullify yourself in order to be accepted. And now that the thread is being pulled, you see how fragile it was, how false it was. But here's the part no one prepares you for. You won't want to let go of the thread. Even knowing that the fabric is fake, even feeling that it suffocates you, there is a part of you that will cling to it desperately. Because letting go means falling into the void, and the void is terrifying. It's easier to keep wearing clothes that don't fit than to be naked, exposed, not knowing what comes next. Jung said that individuation, the process of becoming who you really are, requires a descent into what he called the underworld. It's not a poetic metaphor, it's literal. You need to descend into the darkest parts of yourself, the parts you buried because they were unacceptable, the anger you could never express, the selfishness you were taught to fear, the desire to be seen, valued, loved, not for what you do, but for who you are. These things are down there, in the basement of the psyche, waiting. And when you finally descend, when you open the door and look at them, something strange happens. You realize they are not monsters. They are parts of you that have been exiled. Inner children who were locked away because they cried too loudly, asked for too much, wanted too much. And now as you look at them, you understand. You didn't lock them away out of malice, you locked them away to survive. Because the world around you had no room for the totality of who you were. So you learned to cut pieces of yourself off and hide them where no one could see them. But now by choosing yourself, you are bringing those pieces back. And that is not comfortable. It is chaotic. It is painful. Because those parts of you are angry. They have been ignored for years, decades perhaps. And now that they have a voice, they scream. They scream all the things you never said. All the no's you swallowed, all the times you smiled when you wanted to cry, all the times you stayed when you wanted to leave. And hearing those screams is unbearable, because you realize how much you betrayed yourself. Not once, but 1,000 times. Small daily betrayals that accumulated until they became the very structure of your life. And now you are faced with the most difficult choice. Continue betraying yourself to keep up appearances, or honor those parts of yourself and face the consequences. The consequences are real. They are not abstract. When you start honoring your own needs, when you finally say, I can't, I don't want to, this doesn't work for me anymore, people react. And not with understanding, with anger, with manipulation, with guilt. They will remind you of all the times you were there for them. They will accuse you of having changed, of being selfish, of no longer being who you were. And the cruelest part, they are right. You have changed. You are no longer who you were. And that to them is a betrayal. But what they don't understand, and may never understand, is that continuing to be who you were would be a greater betrayal. A betrayal of yourself. And you've spent too much time betraying yourself. You've spent too much time putting others' peace above your own integrity. And now, for the first time, you're choosing differently. This choice does not come with immediate relief. It comes with guilt. It comes with fear. It comes with sleepless nights wondering if you are being selfish, if you are overreacting, if you should back down. But there is something different now. There is a small flame inside you that refuses to be extinguished. It is the flame of righteous anger, of nascent dignity, of self-respect that is beginning to sprout. And as that flame grows, you begin to notice something surprising. You are breathing better, not literally perhaps, but something inside you that was tight, suffocated is beginning to expand. You are beginning to take up space, not other people's space, but your own space, in the space of your life, which has always been yours, but which you rented out to anyone who needed it. And occupying that space is strange, scary, because you don't know how to behave in it. You don't know what to do when you're not solving someone else's life, when you're not needed, when you're simply as being. But it is precisely in this strangeness that freedom lies. Because for the first time, you're not playing a role, you're existing. And existing without a function, without a purpose, without having to justify your presence, that's revolutionary. There's a kind of silence that comes when you stop running, when you stop filling every second with someone else's needs. And that silence, at first, is terrifying, because it forces you to hear things you've spent your whole life muffling. It forces you to feel the real weight of what you've carried, of what you've lost, of the versions of yourself that you killed to fit into other people's expectations. But if you can stay in that silence, if you don't run back to the noise, to the distraction, to the next person who needs you, something opens up. It's not instant peace, it's recognition. You recognize yourself, maybe for the first time, not as the savior, not as the understanding one, but as someone who also bleeds, who also hurts, who also has the right to ask someone to hold their hand instead of always holding the hands of others. And in that recognition, as painful as it may be, there is freedom, because you stop pretending, you stop acting, and you begin slowly, awkwardly to simply exist. But revolution does not happen without war, and the most brutal war is not with others. It is with the voice in your head that still insists that you are wrong, that you should go back, that you are being cruel. That voice has the tone of everyone who once taught you that your value lay in what you had to offer. It has the voice of your mother, perhaps, of your father, of someone you loved and who, without realizing it, taught you that to love was to disappear. And fighting that voice is exhausting, because it knows all your weaknesses. It knows exactly where to push to make you doubt yourself. It reminds you of all the times you were good, all the times you helped, and it whispers, "See, you can be better than this. Why are you being so selfish now?" But here's the truth that no one told you. That voice is lying. Not because it wants to destroy you, but because it was programmed to protect you in an old, outdated way that no longer works. It was created when you were a child and discovered that disappearing was safer than fully existing. And now, even as an adult, even though you know you no longer need to hide, that voice still operates in childish survival mode. Freud would call this the superego, the part of you that has internalized all the rules, all the expectations, all the shoulds that have been imposed on you. And the superego doesn't want your happiness. It wants your conformity. It wants you to be acceptable. It wants you to not rock the boat, that you don't bother anyone. And for years you obeyed. But now, something inside you is rebelling. And the rebellion starts small. It starts with you allowing a thought that would previously have been unthinkable. What if I don't have to be good all the time? This thought is dangerous because it opens up the possibility that you can be flawed, limited, human, and still worthy of love. Not because you do everything right, but because you exist. This idea is so radical that your body resists it. You feel the anxiety rising, the tightness in your chest, the urge to backtrack, to send that message, to apologize for saying no. But if you can breathe through it, if you can let the anxiety be there without acting on it, something changes. You realize that anxiety is just an alarm signal from a system that is being reconfigured. It's not true. It's just fear. And as you learn to distinguish between fear and truth, you begin to make different decisions. Small ones at first. You don't respond immediately. You say, "I need to think about it," instead of automatically saying yes. You cancel an appointment that was going to drain you. And every time you do that, the voice of guilt screams louder. But something else happens too. The voice of your true self, the one that was whispering back there, gets a little stronger. And it's in this tension between the two voices that you live for a while. It's uncomfortable. It's unstable. Because you're no longer who you were, but you're not yet fully who you're becoming. You're in the middle of the journey. And the middle of the road is the loneliest place there is, but it's also the truest place. Because that's where transformation really happens. Not in grand declarations. Not in dramatic decisions. But in the small daily acts of choosing yourself, even when it hurts. Even when no one applauds. Even when you yourself doubt. And if you're in that place right now, in the middle of the road where everything is uncertain and nothing is comfortable, I need to tell you something. You're not wrong. You're not being selfish. You're not abandoning anyone. You are, for the first time, refusing to abandon yourself. And that is the bravest act you can perform. If this script is touching something in you that was dormant, something you were afraid to look at, don't let it go back to sleep. Subscribe to this channel, because what we do here is not to entertain, it's to wake up, and you deserve to be awake to your own life. As you stand firm in this choice, something unexpected happens. The people who stayed, the few who didn't run away when you stopped being functional, start to see you differently. Not with pity, not with concern, but with something like respect. Because there is a presence in you that wasn't there before. A solidity. You are no longer floating according to the needs of others. You are anchored in something internal. And that, strange as it may seem, makes you more reliable. Not as a savior, but as a person. Because the truth is that no one really trusts someone who has no boundaries. No one respects someone who says yes to everything. It may be convenient, it may be useful, but it does not inspire respect. And now that you are starting to have boundaries, now that you are starting to say no when necessary, you are becoming someone who can be taken seriously. someone whose word yes really means something, because it is no longer automatic, it is a choice. And that's when the anger, that sacred anger that was protecting you, begins to transform. It doesn't disappear, but it refines itself. It ceases to be explosive and becomes discernment. You no longer need to shout to defend your boundaries. You just need to maintain them, quietly, firmly, without justifying yourself. And that calm firmness is more powerful than any explosion ever was. There is a dignity that emerges from this process. Not the performative dignity you pretended to have while nullifying yourself, but a true dignity. The dignity of someone who knows themselves, who knows where they end and where the other begins, who doesn't need external validation to know they have value. And that dignity changes everything. It changes how you walk into a room, how you speak, how you choose who to be with and who to walk away from. You realize that you have spent your entire life negotiating your presence, your energy, your time, your soul, always thinking you had to pay for the acceptance of others. But now you understand, acceptance that requires you to disappear is not acceptance. It is erasure, and you no longer want to be erased. This realization does not make you arrogant. It makes you selective. You stop trying to prove your worth to those who will never see it. You stop bowing down to be loved by those who are incapable of loving anyone but themselves. And in this selectivity, in this refusal to lower yourself, you discover something precious. Peace. Not the peace of someone who has given up, but the peace of someone who has finally stopped fighting against themselves. But the path is not linear. There are days when you wake up and the old temptation is there, waiting. The temptation to go back, to be who you were, to please, to care, to dissolve again in the needs of others. Because at least there you knew who you were. You had a clear identity, even if it was false. And now in this new way of existing, you sometimes feel lost, without a map, without certainties. Those days are the most dangerous, because it's easy to romanticize the past. It's easy to forget how much it hurt, how empty you were, how much you were dying inside while pretending to be alive. Memory is selective. It shows you only the parts where you felt needed, important. It hides the sleepless nights, the exhaustion, the silent despair. So you need to remember. You need to return to the truth of what you were, not to punish yourself, but so you don't lose yourself. Because the part of you that still wants to please is persuasive. It convinces you that you're exaggerating, that it wasn't so bad, that you should give it another chance. But giving the old pattern another chance is not generosity. It's self-destruction, and you've already destroyed yourself enough. What you're doing now, this slow and painful process of rebuilding yourself, is what Jung called individuation. It's not about becoming perfect. It's about becoming whole. It's about integrating all the parts of yourself that have been rejected. The anger, the healthy selfishness, the need to be seen, the desire to receive, not just to give. These things are not flaws. They are essential parts of a complete human being. And you spent so much time cutting them off that you forgot they were yours. Now you're gluing the pieces back together, and the result isn't pretty at first. It's uneven, imperfect. It has scars, but it's real. And for the first time in your life, you're allowing yourself to be real, not an edited version, not a performance, but you, with all the contradictions, all the flaws, all the messy and beautiful humanity that implies. And as you allow yourself to be real, something surprising happens to your relationships. The ones that survived, the few that remained after you stopped nullifying yourself, deepen, because now there is someone there. Not just a mirror reflecting the needs of others, but a person with their own opinions, with their own limits, with a rich and complex inner life that does not exist for the sake of anyone else. And in these relationships, you discover something you have never experienced before: reciprocity. Not the performative reciprocity where people give back because it's polite, but genuine reciprocity where two whole people meet, neither trying to save the other, neither nullifying themselves, just two presences recognizing each other. And that which you never thought possible, is what love should always have been. But there are still difficult days, days when guilt comes back with full force, days when you wonder if you're being selfish by prioritizing your own needs. And on those days, you need to remember something fundamental. Taking care of yourself is not selfishness. It is responsibility. It is the only way to have something genuine to offer the world. Schopenhauer was right when he spoke about true compassion. It cannot come from a place of depletion. It cannot come from someone who is negating themselves. Real compassion, the kind that truly helps, that truly heals, comes from someone who is whole, from someone who knows their own limits and honors them, from someone who can look at another's suffering without drowning in it. And you are learning to do that. You are learning to feel without absorbing, to witness without carrying, to be present without losing yourself. And that is a skill that only develops when you stop using other people's pain as an escape from your own. When you finally face your inner emptiness and fill it with your own presence. There is something liberating about realizing that you are not responsible for saving anyone. That each person has their own journey, their own lessons, their own path. And that by trying to save someone from their journey, you are actually robbing them of the opportunity to grow, to become stronger, to discover their own ability to survive. You spent so much time believing that it was cruel to let someone suffer. But now you understand, what is cruel is to rob someone of the chance to learn from their own pain, to discover they are capable, to become who they need to be. And by stopping intervening, by stopping saving, you are not abandoning anyone. You are finally respecting them as adults capable of taking care of themselves. And in that respect for the autonomy of others, you discover your own value. Because if you can trust that others can take care of themselves, you can also trust that you can take care of yourself, that you don't need a savior, that you can be your own safe haven. This emotional independence doesn't make you distant. It makes you free. And from freedom comes something you never had. Joy. Not the artificial joy of someone trying to convince themselves, but the genuine joy of someone who is alive, of someone who is present, of someone who is finally allowed to fully exist. And then comes the moment you didn't expect. The moment when you realize that the greatest betrayal didn't come from others. It came from yourself. Not when you started saying no, but all the years you said yes while dying inside. All the moments you betrayed your own truth to buy the acceptance of those who would never truly value you. This realization cuts deep, because it's easy to blame others. It's comfortable to say that they took advantage of you, that they were selfish, that they used you. And maybe they were all of those things. But the harder truth is that you allowed it. You offered yourself. You created the instruction manual on how to drain you and handed it to them. And until you take responsibility for that part, the part where you were complicit in your own destruction, you will never be completely free. Nietzsche spoke of resentment as poison for the soul. And the empath who does not free themselves carries this poison their entire life. They blame others eternally. They live retelling stories of how they were used, abandoned, betrayed. And in these stories, there is always a truth, but there is also a lie. The lie is that you were only a victim. The truth is that you were also the architect of your own prison. And accepting this is not punishing yourself. It is freeing yourself. Because as long as you see yourself only as a victim, you are powerless. You are at the mercy of others. But when you recognize your part, when you see that you chose this, even if unconsciously, you regain your power. Because if you chose this, you can choose differently. And this is where the last illusion falls apart. The illusion that you were helping out of love, that your kindness was pure, that you were the good person in the story. But forced kindness is not kindness. It's theater. It's performance. It's a negotiation disguised as virtue. And underneath that performance was something you avoided looking at. The fear of being nothing without the role of savior. This fear is old. As old as the first time you realized that existing was not enough, that you needed to justify yourself. You needed to be useful, because just being, just existing without producing, without solving, without saving, seemed like a crime, an illegitimate occupation of space. And so you learned to pay for your existence with self-sacrifice, with infinite availability, with the lie that you had no limits. But you do have limits. You always have. And every time you exceeded them, every time you ignored the inner voice that said enough, you weren't being noble, you were mutilating yourself. And you called it love because it was easier than admitting what it really was. Fear. Fear of being disposable. Fear of discovering that without your role, you might be nobody. But this discovery you feared so much, that you are nobody without the role of savior, is paradoxically your liberation. Because when you finally fall into this abyss, when you finally lose all your fabricated identities, you discover something surprising. You are still here. You still exist. And you exist not as a role, but as a presence, as consciousness, as life happening. And that existence without justification, without utility, without having to prove anything, is vaster, deeper, truer than any role you have ever played. Because for the first time, you are not being for someone else. You simply are. And that being, that raw, unedited existence, is where your true strength lies. Heidegger spoke of being towards death, the idea that only when we confront our finitude, our mortality, our total lack of control over existence, do we begin to live authentically. And the empath who chooses themselves goes through a death, not physical but symbolic. The savior dies. The available dies. The one who never disappoints dies. And from that death, something new is born. Something that doesn't have a name yet. Something that doesn't fit into a social role. Something that is simply you. But there is a price for this rebirth. The price is loneliness. Not the circumstantial loneliness of being physically alone, but the existential loneliness of realizing that no one can make this journey for you. That no one can save you from having to become who you are. And that most people around you will never understand this transformation because they are still stuck in the same games you have abandoned. And you will want to explain. You will want them to understand why you have changed, why you are no longer the same person. But you cannot, because understanding this requires having gone through the same descent. And not everyone is ready to descend. Not everyone wants to wake up, and you need to come to terms with that. You need to accept that your freedom will cost you relationships. It will cost you the approval of those who loved you only when you were convenient. But what you gain in return is infinitely greater. You gain yourself, whole, not fragmented, not divided between who you are and who others need you to be, just you. And discovering that you are enough, not because you are perfect, but because you are real, is a reward that no external approval could ever give you. There is something deeply liberating about realizing that you don't owe your existence to anyone, that you don't have to pay for being alive, that you can simply exist without justifying yourself, without apologizing, without bowing down. And when that realization sets in, not as an intellectual idea but as a visceral feeling, something inside you calms down. That constant anxiety of not being enough begins to dissolve, because you stop trying to prove something that never needed proof. And in that inner silence, in that peace that comes from no longer being at war with yourself, you can finally hear what you really want, what you really feel, who you really are. Not the version shaped by the expectations of others, but you, raw, true, imperfect but whole. And it is from this wholeness, not perfection but the integration of all your parts, that your true contribution to the world is born. Not empty sacrifice, but full presence. And full presence is what the world needs most. Not more martyrs, but more real people. And as you settle into this new way of being, something unexpected happens. Compassion returns, but it is not the same compassion as before. It is not that desperate compassion that consumed you, that made you absorb the pain of others as if it were your own. It is something different. It is a compassion that comes from fullness, not from lack. A compassion that can witness suffering without drowning in it. That can be present without losing itself. And that perhaps is the greatest irony of this whole journey. You spent your whole life believing that you had to annul yourself in order to be compassionate. That true love required self-destruction. But now you discover that it was exactly the opposite. That only when you become whole can you truly love. Because love that comes from need is possessive. Love that comes from wholeness is liberating. You no longer need others to need you. And that changes everything. It changes who you allow into your life. It changes how you relate to others. It changes what you are willing to tolerate and what you gently but firmly refuse. And in that conscious selectivity, you discover relationships you never imagined possible. Relationships where you can be flawed, limited, human, and still be loved. Because the people who love you now don't love you for what you do. They love you for who you are. And you finally can receive that love. You can let it in. Because you are no longer afraid that if you don't perform, if you are not useful, they will leave. If they do, you know you will survive. You have already survived the worst thing, the loss of yourself, and you came back. There is a quiet strength that comes from someone who has died and been reborn. A presence that does not need to prove itself, that does not need to convince, that simply is. And that presence, that calm solidity you've developed, is magnetic. Not because you're trying to attract, but because you've stopped deviating from yourself. And when someone stops running away from themselves, when someone anchors themselves in their own truth, others feel it. Not consciously perhaps, but they feel it. And you realize that you can help people in a way you never could before. Not by saving them, not by carrying their burdens, but by being a mirror. By showing them through your own presence that it is possible to exist whole. That it is possible to have boundaries and still be kind. That it is possible to say no and still have compassion. That it is possible to choose yourself and not be a selfish monster, but an integrated human being. This is the true gift of the empath who frees themselves. Not sacrifice, but the living demonstration that liberation is possible, that you can get out of emotional prison, that you can stop negotiating your existence, that you can finally live. And living, truly living, not just existing, is strange at first, because you've spent so much time surviving that you've forgotten what it's like to be truly alive. But as you allow yourself to feel without filters, without fear, without the defense mechanism that made you escape into the pain of others, you discover sensations you had forgotten. the joy of doing something just because you want to, the pleasure of being alone without feeling abandoned, the peace of not having to solve anything for anyone, including yourself. And in that peace, you understand the last lesson, the most important one, the one that changes everything. You understand that choosing yourself was not selfishness, it was love, self-love, the kind of love that society taught you to fear, to call narcissism, to repress. But self-love is not arrogance, it is recognition. It is saying to yourself, I deserve to exist, I deserve to take up space, I deserve to live a life that is mine. And when you say that, not as an empty statement but as a felt truth, everything reorganizes itself. Your priorities change, your relationships are reconfigured, your choices align with who you really are, not who you think you should be. And for the first time, you feel like you're on the right path, not because someone told you so, but because something inside you recognizes it, something deep, something you always knew but spent your whole life silencing. There are days when you still feel the temptation to go back, days when the old voice whispers that you are being too hard, too demanding, too selfish. But now you recognize that voice for what it is, an echo of a past that no longer serves you. And you don't have to fight it, you just have to not obey it. You just have to keep walking toward your own truth, even when it calls you back to the familiar lie. And as you continue, as you refuse to go back, something extraordinary happens. You discover that you had resources within you that you never used, because you spent all your energy taking care of others. Creativity that was dormant, dreams that were shelved, versions of yourself that never had a chance to be born because there was no space. You had filled all the available space with the needs of others. Now, with room to breathe, these parts of you begin to emerge, and you discover interests you didn't know you had, talents you never explored, ways of being in the world you never experienced. And each discovery is a small resurrection. Every time you allow yourself to do something just because you want to, you are saying yes to life. Your life, not the life others wanted you to live. So if you're reading this now and recognizing your own story in these words, know this: you're not wrong for wanting to stop. You're not wrong for feeling angry. You're not wrong for finally choosing yourself. You're for the first time doing the right thing. And the road ahead won't be easy, but it will be true. And truth, however painful it may be at first, always leads you home, to yourself. The first step is simple, but it's not easy. It's to stop. Stop responding immediately. Stop saying yes automatically. Stop assuming that the other person's needs are more important than yours. And before you do anything, ask yourself, what do I really want here? What do I really feel? What do I really need? And then, and this is crucial, honor that answer. Even if it disappoints someone, even if it causes discomfort, even if it makes you look selfish in the eyes of those who have never seen you as a person, only as a function. Because in the end, the only person you're going to spend your whole life with is yourself. And if you don't choose you, who will? Tell me here in the comments, when was the first time you realized you were neglecting yourself for someone else? And what prevented you from stopping sooner? If you've made it this far, you've already taken a step beyond most people. You watch the videos. You reflect on each idea. Remember, success is a decision. The choice is yours. Count on me and follow the white rabbit.